like I said, this is none too long. So mostly what we're going to talk about is how you can screw up sampling. You can introduce bias into sampling, which is very easy. And by very easy, I mean just it happens. It will happen, especially when sampling subjects. So people, especially, are prone to bias. If you're sampling, if you're doing, if you work at a battery factory and you're sampling every 10th battery off the line, there's going to be much less bias. But a lot of what statistics is for is, right, drawing inference about stuff that people do, um, or, you know, experiments, like drawing inference from experiments like a vaccine. So we'll talk about that in the coming days, which will be very interesting, I think. But today we'll talk about how we can kind of screw up sampling. All right, so inference, like I said, is just the process of drawing conclusions about a population on the basis of sample data. So a margin of error sets the bounds on the likely size of error. An error is not like human error. So that's not like you did a bad job of sampling, because there is no statistical way to account for that. If you did a bad job of sampling, all you can do is throw out the sample and start over. But when we say error, what we really mean in statistics is variability by random chance. So anytime you take a sample, you're hoping that it's representative of the greater population. But if you were to go in and take a different sample, you would probably draw slightly different results, right? Because you wouldn't get the same exact representation of the population. There's that variability from sample to sample. So that's what a margin of error accounts for, is just random variability. It does not account for bad sampling techniques that we'll talk about today. Now, the benefit of increasing sample size is that larger samples give better information. And really, hopefully that's intuitive, right? Larger samples means more information, means better results. If you take it to an extreme, right? If you could get a census, so if you could count all people, you would know we wouldn't need statistics. There would be no use of my class. I would be out of a job. But because populations are dynamics, and I'm really referencing sampling people, like polling people, right? It's too large of a population. It's dynamic. People are dying. People are being born. Depending on what you're sampling. In my head, I since we're in an election year, I continually think about polls and polling people and those types of samples. So people are constantly turning 18. So the polls vary day to day. But larger samples give better information. They give more information. And then you're able to create better inference about the population. So draw better conclusions. Really what you want is just what's in the green box. I'll pause here, wait for you. Just give me a green check when you're good to go on this slide. All right, this is a lot. What you need is those red definitions. So a sampling frame, when we talk about that, that's just a list of all the items in your population. So when I talk about a population, that's a general idea of what we're trying to study. And then a sampling frame is specific. So if I say the population of all students at our school, that's a general idea. The sampling frame would be the computer program of registrations, because that's exactly where you guys exist in our school, if that makes sense, right? So you're registered in a computer program at our school. That's the sampling frame. That's what I would actually use to draw a sample of students from our school. All right, now we're going to talk about sort of forms of bad sample, or not necessarily bad, just things that are introduced that can cause bias in a sample, and often do. So undercoverage is when some members of the population can't be chosen in a sample. Right? So this would be like, okay, I'm going to choose a sample of Arizonans because I want to conduct a poll of who they're going to vote for. And the way I'm going to do it is call people on their listed landline from the phone book. And so that undercoverage is introduced there because cell phones aren't listed in the phone book. So you're only going to get people. Do you guys know what a landline is, or am I? Okay. And anyways, so people who only have cell phones, which is, most normal people, probably all of you and me, maybe your parents have a landline at your house, but like they're not, you would not be included in that population, even though you should be, right? If you're 18 and could vote. And so undercoverage would occur in that case because we've accidentally systematically excluded part of the population. And so like our census, we're in a census year right now, which, right, they want to count everybody in the United States and get all of their demographic information. But there's still undercoverage in the census because we have a homelessness issue and they can't count. They try to, but they're not going to be able to account for all people who aren't in homes. So non-response is also an issue in specifically things like polling, and that just occurs when people refuse to participate, right? So when you take a random sample, you have to go to your sampling frame first, decide on that sample, and then go contact those people in that sample. You can't force them to participate. We'll talk about ethics in statistics and in statistical studies in the next section. But you can't force people to participate. And so oftentimes, especially in surveys and polls, people will just refuse to participate. So the problem with that is you can't just replace them with people who are willing to participate because they could systematically differ from those refusing to participate. So it would be, I think there's problems in this next problem set that talk about, like, okay, I'm trying to study whether students who listen to music while they do their homework do better on exams than students who don't. And so it would be like, it's similar to like the voluntary response issue, right? If I were like, okay, who would like to do their homework with music on? And, those of you who like to do that, volunteer. And then I check how you score on a test versus those of you who don't. Well, if you volunteer to do it, you probably systematically differ from those who don't. What I really need is a random sample of people, and then I need to say, you guys listen to music, and then another random sample and say, you guys don't, so that I can tell the difference. So when I say non-response, the issue that causes is you can't just go, okay, I lost 3 people to non-response. I knocked on their door, they didn't answer. I'll just put 3 new houses in. That doesn't work, because people who answer the door may systematically differ in their opinions or their responses than people who don't. And then bias is just a systematic pattern of incorrect responses, or we'll talk about another kind of another definition of bias, which is bias is when you systematically overestimate or underestimate the result of something. And then in a survey, you want to be very careful with the wording of questions, because it's the most important influence on the answers given to a sample survey. So there are a ton of things that you wouldn't necessarily think about, especially when you're surveying people, that you would have to account for statistically to make sure that your results are robust. And by that, I mean you have kind of conclusive results that you can rely on. And so one of the things, obviously, is wording of the question. You can influence people with the wording of a question, and we'll go over some extreme examples of that in 1 second. But another thing is, if you have multiple questions in a survey, one thing you have to do is randomize the order of those questions, because people get what's called survey fatigue. I mean, especially in this environment, this is like very rampant right now. We're constantly given surveys. I just had to take another survey for the college board about AP stuff, because they're trying to figure out basically what to do about the AP exams. And so they're constantly surveying us AP teachers to see, like, where are our students at? What sort of technology do you have? What sort of issues do you have? And so I had to take like a 30-minute survey last night, let's say, and people get survey fatigue, right? So you get tired by the end of it and you're like, I'm just going to choose whatever option and not think about it too hard. And so if you continually put the questions in the same order, then those last questions will be biased by that survey fatigue. People won't be thinking of them, as much as they're thinking of the first question. So the thing you can do is randomize the order to make sure that some people are getting, those last questions first, some people are getting those first questions last, and, the questions aren't being as influenced by that survey fatigue. But one very obvious one is the wording of the question. So this definitely can introduce bias, and it's oftentimes used to introduce bias, right? On purpose by whoever is conducting the survey. If it's not an ethical statistician, then oftentimes it's like a media network and they're trying to get an answer in a certain way. And so they'll word the question a certain way. And so let's look at an example or a couple examples of this, I believe. All right, I think I talked about this one a little bit in a previous class, but this was the one about in 1988, Sheer Height published a book entitled Women in Love, A Cultural Revolution in Progress, in which she claimed 70% of women who had been married 5 years or more were having extramarital affairs. Aaron? Just kidding. Height's survey was sent to 100,000 women, and her conclusions were based on 4,500 women who responded. What was the non-response rate for this study? How might this non-response rate have affected the results of the survey? So this is kind of this includes multiple sources of bias. So we have a huge non-response rate, right? So She sent it out to 100,000 women and 4,500 responded. So that means 95,500 didn't respond. Which, if we put that out of 100,000, that's a 95.5% non-response rate. And so because obviously this is voluntary response, this kind of has the Yelp effect where the only people who are responding probably have strong opinions about something. And in this case, this is, I would say, probably, hopefully, an overestimate of infidelity in 5 years or longer marriages. I would expect that 70% is a little bit high on that. And probably the people who responded had, maybe a bad marriage. I don't know why you would ever write in to a lady soliciting about your extramarital affairs, but I would imagine it's probably because you have a bad marriage or something. And so, since it's such a high non-response rate, I would not trust these results, and also probably consider it unethical to publish these results. Yeah, I would agree. I would agree, Katie. Although, I mean, I don't know how many husbands are reading this book called Women in Love, A Cultural Revolution in Progress in 1988. It was a little bit more patriarchal back then, more rampant, poisonous masculinity. I don't think dudes would be reading that. So you were probably pretty safe if you were a cheating wife. All right. This one's even more disturbing. So this was actually, I believe, a New York Times published article back then, but it was a badly worded question that indicated, and they published these results, that nearly 1/3 of all Americans had some doubt that the Holocaust occurred. But here was the way the polling organization worded the question. Does it seem possible or does it seem impossible to you that the Nazi extermination of the Jews never happened? So the question is worded incredibly poorly, right? Like it's hard. It's like yes or no. I mean, whatever the good one is, whatever the one is where I'm not a Nazi in this case. So it was a very confusing wording of the question. The question was revised, and then the percentage who were certain that the Holocaust occurred dramatically increased, although I think it's a dead link at this point. But when it was live, it only increased, it increased to like 95% or something like that, which was still kind of disturbing to me that 5% of the population doesn't think that the Holocaust occurred, although this was probably like 3 years ago when I made these slides, and now it's more reasonable to me. Now it's more clear that 5% of the population would think that the Holocaust didn't occur. Sadly. But this is just an emphasis on why it's important to, be very clear in the wording of the question.
Mr. Toller.
Go ahead.
So for like with the polls this year with the election, like I know like they predicted Joe Biden to win and he did, but
Overall,
like I
sure.
feel like there were still states that were like predicted to go blue and stuff like that
Yes.
they got wrong.
Yes.
But I haven't seen anything about like why they got it wrong.
Yeah.
Maybe I've been looking, but like do you know from a statistics perspective anything about like the most recent election or anything like
For
that?
sure. So they did the same in 2016, right? A lot of the polls got things incredibly wrong. In fact, most of the polling had Hillary Clinton winning overall, um, which was obviously 100% wrong. So they they kind of did an autopsy on it in 2016, the pollsters, so the people who were doing the surveys, and they were like, what did we do wrong? And a lot of what they got out of that, there was like a big thing that they decided that was Trump shyness. And yeah, Katie put a great link in there. 538 is Nate Silver's website, who is like a he's not a pollster, but what he does, he's like an aggregator. So he like takes all the polls done by different pollsters and aggregates them and analyzes them and sort of decides what would be the most reasonable outcome, if that makes sense. And he has some pretty good analysis, but he right. So sorry. In 2016, they did an autopsy of why their polls were so bad, and they decided it was sort of a Trump shyness situation. So people were embarrassed to admit that that's what they were going to do. In 2020, that wasn't the case. Like, I mean, people were driving around with Trump flags, right? Like, there were huge parades and marches. It was pretty clear that if people were going to vote for Trump, they were going to be outright about that. And so they tried to account for some of those issues in their sampling, but they got the overall idea right. They got the Joe Biden won or whatever, and that was kind of predicted. But you're right. Like, he was also predicted state by state to win Florida, for example, by 8 points, and he lost Florida. So a lot of that is margin of error. So it's sampling variability, and so they don't know. If I listen to this podcast every day called The Daily, it's the New York Times daily podcast or whatever, and they did an analysis of this. They like interviewed the New York Times pollster who kind of got a bunch of stuff wrong, and they were talking to him about like, why did you get it wrong, and are these surveys detrimental at this point? Because are they influencing elections, right? Are they possibly giving people who are on one side a false sense of security and causing an uprising in the other side? So when, for example, you're reporting that Joe Biden is going to win Florida by 8 points, is that causing Democrats in Florida to get a false sense of security and be like, I don't need, my vote doesn't matter, he's got this locked up? And is it causing an uprising in Republicans? So is it detrimental? Which is one theory, right? So it could be not statistical reporting, not doing what it's supposed to do, where we're supposed to get information from it, and it could be influencing instead. Or they think not Trump shyness, but there's this, I don't know, have you guys heard of like the Lincoln Project? There's this like there was an uprising of like Republicans against Trump, because of not necessarily his policies but his behavior. And they think that maybe they sampled, when they went out to sample, and they stratified by Democrats and Republicans, right? I've talked about this. So if whatever, Florida is, 70% Republican, 30% Democrat, then they would want to take a sample that has the same proportions. If they went out and did that and happened to get a sample of Republicans who, were anti-Trump instead of a sample of Republicans who were mixed or whatever, but they don't know yet. They're going to have to do an autopsy on that. But in general, I think the link that Katie put up is really good by Nate Silver. They weren't great, but they were within mostly the margins of error. So what's not reported a lot of times in the media is that margin of error. They'll be like, Biden's up by 8%, but they won't say plus or minus 3% or whatever. And while I don't think it was within the margin of error in Florida, it was in most states. So yeah, go ahead.
I just kind of have a question going off this so I can get a better perspective, but like, I don't remember like polling or anything like that, like any of these issues, like because I was younger, right? Like when Obama was elected, were there still like issues like this?
No,
this just,
I mean, yes, there always are. It's always it's normally within the margins of error, and the margin of error stuff will make more sense once we get to that section in statistics. Mm-hmm. But things were less crazy when you guys were younger, and statistically, like surveys made more sense. It's getting harder to survey people, and more bias is being introduced, which makes teaching this kind of unit a little bit more interesting, but harder because the polls haven't been as good. But I think if you read through that 538 article that Katie posted, it does make good points. Like they're not great, and that's because polls and surveys constantly, you cannot get rid of these types of bias. You cannot get rid of things like undercoverage. You cannot get rid of non-response. And like I said, the only way to get rid of non-response is not to introduce new people. You can't go, okay, that guy didn't answer my question, I'll just get another guy that will. Because the people that don't respond may systematically differ in their opinions. So what you would have to do is once you get your first non-response, throw out all the results you've gotten so far and start with a new sample. Go back to your sampling frame. Go back to the computer where you have everybody entered, choose a new sample, and start over. And then once you get a new non-response, throw out that entire sample and start over again, which isn't plausible, right? So all surveys contain this non-response bias, and they also contain undercoverage. It's impossible not to have undercoverage in some sense. So all these surveys contains all sorts of bias, and I think what's happened in recent years is the bias has increased sort of exponentially due to multiple factors, right? The media sort of bias in both directions has started to separate. We have less objective coverage of things, and like everything's sort of cherry picking, trying to sort of influence views. And that's not, I'm not like a conspiracy theorist. I try to use the most objective stuff. I read the New York Times, and I still think I think that's one of the least biased, but still relatively biased in one direction, right? There was like a study conducted by the AP a few years ago, like what media network are the least biased, and they all have some sort of skew in one direction or the other. And I think like Reuters was the least, so you have to go to like a European sort of source if you want American news without some sort of a skewed perspective, but they still had a directional bias of some sort. So I think that's probably the case, is that surveys, especially in recent years, have become more difficult to conduct and extract information from people without introducing, little amounts of bias. All right. Let's do this last example, I think, and I'm probably going to assign the formative assessment. I'll just have you guys do that on your own, and we'll score it at the beginning of the next class. But let's do this last example. All right, so the sample is chosen at random from a telephone directory. What sort of bias could that introduce? I kind of already talked about this. It's undercoverage, right? Have you guys ever seen a phone book? Do you get phone books at your doorstep still?
Fuller, how old do you think we are? You keep asking about landlines and phone
Do you have a
books.
landline, Katie?
We had a landline. Yeah, the Novaks do. We had a landline until I was like 8 or 9.
Okay.
We had one of those little headset ones that like connects to your belt and you can like walk around with it.
I know. I don't mean to. Yeah, I'm not. Here's the thing. Here's what I'm basing this off of. Like 10 years ago, when I was a teacher, you guys know I love movies, and I would always reference movies and like make jokes. And I made some sort of Fight Club joke where I was like, "You don't talk about this thing," like the first rule of Fight Club. And everybody just stared at me, and I was like, "You guys don't know what Fight Club is?" And they're like, "What are you talking about?" How many people have seen Fight Club? Raise your hand. Nobody raised their hand in the class. I'm glad you guys have. And I was like, "Oh Christ, I'm this old now." And then I thought about it, and Fight Club came out in like 1999 when I was in high school. And I was like, this makes sense. But I think you guys have seen it because it's like now in the English curriculum. Like there are English teachers who make their kids read that whatever Bret Easton Ellis Fight Club book. The Novaks have a landline too because their dad is like a lawyer and
Also, my dad's like really old, so I think that might be part of it. But it still rings like on occasion. I know like the ringtone for it, but we never use it.
yeah.
My
But
grandparents both have like both sets of grandparents have landlines.
um
So
phone books though, I was just thinking about that. I don't think I've seen one like it. I don't think since I've been married I've gotten one on our doorstep. So
we like opt out of the ones in our neighborhood. You can like choose not to take it.
have
And
you
my
guys ever
mom's always
have
like,
you ever used a phone book?
no.
I would like go through it for fun as like a child,
Yeah.
like just to go through it because it was fun, but like never actually used it.
We had my dad's like really weird friend just came to my house wearing overalls and no shirt, and he's so weird. I never seen him, but he showed up, and I was home alone. I was like, "Yeah," and he was like, "Do you guys have a phone book?" And I was like, "No," and he's like, "All right," but it's just a funny story I remember.
I would have to like if I wanted to call a kid. I remember in like fourth grade in my class, I didn't know his phone number. I would look up his last name in the white pages and like call his house.
We were like listed when I was little. We were listed not as Brown. We like used my dad's middle name or like my mom's maiden name or something because everyone's last name is Brown, and so like nobody could find us. And my mom like because we had a landline, we didn't want like random callers. I
Right.
remember that. I don't know why. I was really little, probably.
Yeah, they were hella good for like prank calls and stuff too. All right, let's finish this up. Some people cannot be contacted in 5 calls. So yeah, oftentimes when they're trying to survey people, they'll try and contact them multiple times to reduce the non-response rate. But if they can't contact them in 5 calls, they'll just call it a loss. But that would be non-response. And then interviewers choose people walking by on the sidewalk to interview. And that's not something we talked about today, but we talked about previously. That's just convenience. Which is, yeah, oftentimes can introduce bias into your sample, right? So we saw that in the, when we were sampling the cornfield, the convenience sample closest to the farmer's house, when only the river was irrigating. They were the furthest away from the river, and so they yielded the least amount of corn, and thus would give him a bad estimate of what the cornfield had. So I always think of this one like when I go to the library and there's the people out front surveying to legalize pot. That's a convenience sample, but that's an intentional convenience sample, right? They're trying to get you to sign their thing. They're standing at the library because who goes to the libraries? Hippies. Hippies who like free stuff go to the library, who are probably okay with legalized pot. So they're intentionally biasing their sample in that case. All right, I think that's. Oh, this is just another wording of the question example. You don't need to write this down. I think you guys get the wording of the question bias. But here's what I'll say I need you to do before next class.